100. And now we're moving in this week 3 to Judaism as the first Western religion we're going to look at. And again, these are religions of confrontation or encounter between a God, a personal God who is there, and us as humanity. Here's a quote from one of the greatest commentators and theologians of the Jewish tradition in the 20th century, Abraham Joshua Heschel. He believed that the essence of understanding the God of the Jewish tradition is pathos. Pathos is the central category of the prophetic understanding of God. And we'll get into who the prophets are in just a few minutes. Well, actually, in another lecture, but that will be part of the unfolding of the Hebrew Bible. Pathos finds its deepest expression in the fact that God can actually suffer. Abraham Joshua Heschel, 1907 to 1972. Also on the way to Judaism, I want to quote C.S. Lewis, since this is a course in which writing is part of things. Lewis is one of the great writers also of the 20th century. And he said this with an amazing image about writing. Quote, "The way for a person to develop a style is to know exactly what he or she wants to say and to be sure she is saying exactly that. The reader, we must remember, does not start by knowing what we mean." And this is just an important realization. I write a lot. I've written books and blogs and articles, but I always have to remember that what's in my head is not in the head of the reader. The reader, we must remember, does not start by knowing what we mean. If our words are ambiguous, our meaning will escape our reader. I sometimes think that writing, and here's a great image, that writing is like driving sheep down a road. If there is any gate left to the left or to the right, the reader will most certainly go into it. Now to some statistics on Judaism and where it fits. You can see the great religions in terms of size to the right on this slide. Judaism, of the world religions, is the smallest religion that we are going to consider. And of the classic 5 religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Hinduism, and Buddhism, it is the smallest. So we have to take this in. Why is it such an important religion? It accounts for about less than 1% of the world's population. There are about 15 to 16 million Jews, approximately half, somewhere near half, live in the United States. The reason is that Judaism has managed to exist over a long period of time. It has managed to be in throughout the world, and it is therefore seen as one of the world religions. It's also extremely important because it's the foundation of the 2 biggest religions, the next 2 religions that we'll look at, Christianity and Islam. So here are the questions we need to keep asking. Why is this considered a religion? So given the definitions of religion we've looked at, the religion might say, of ultimate concern that Houston Smith presented, or the 4 C's of Stephen Prothero, which is a little bit more detail in that, creeds, cultus, code, and community. How is this a religion? And particularly, what are Judaism's rituals, authorities, concept of the sacred or God, and what is its main scripture? So in overviewing Judaism in these next lectures, I will be looking at the biblical texts, not because Jews are all or even mostly a kind of fundamentalist textual religion, or that they don't practice a kind of fundamentalist textual religion, but because the text and the story of the text is so important to the foundation of what Judaism is about. It is, if nothing else, a religion of the book, and Jews, like Muslims and Christians, are people of the book. Now, if you have grown up reading the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament in Christianity, there's a different organization of essentially the same books in the Jewish canon or rule of Scripture. There's the inner circle. The most important 5 books is Torah, meaning law or instruction. So it's not law in the sense of, the law of you can't cross the street without the light turning green if you're walking, or whatever. Not that kind of law. It's also instruction. It gives positive instruction. It's not just negative law, but it's positive instruction or law. This is also called the Pentateuch, which means 5 books. Penta meaning 5. Pentateuch. That's the first circle. Imagine around that, the second is the old circle, the next circle, of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, which is the prophets or the Nevi'im in Hebrew. And they circle around the Old Testament center of the Torah, and then around those are the writings, the Ketuvim. We're going to be looking at Torah in this particular segment or lecture, particularly at the book of Genesis. In that book and throughout the Hebrew Bible, you find some major themes. Monotheism, God, or sometimes spelled G hyphen or /D, is singular and personal. So in the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew language, the word for God, as we'll learn from the book of Exodus, is Yahweh, the one who is, which was so holy a name that pious Jews, and many even to this day, will not pronounce it. Instead, will pronounce the Lord or Elohim. So that's why, in terms of rendering this in English, many Jews will spell it G, without even a vowel D. Most importantly, God is singular. There is only one God, and God can be known personally. God speaks, God has intentions, God has actions in history. And so the center, in many ways, is faith or trust in God. So faith is important here. It is fundamentally trust. It's a trust in the relationship with God. It's fiduciary trust, you might call it. It's not trust in things, in doctrines first and foremost, but it's trust in God as a guiding person at some level, a guiding deity. So that God, because God is personal in the Jewish religion, creates covenants, creates a connection. And instead of being this a religion of orthodoxy, of right belief, orthos, doxos in Greek, right belief, it's a religion of orthos praxis, orthopraxy, right action, and a religion of right action. So God creates covenants, as we'll see, with the people of Israel. And out of those covenants, there is then actions that are to be taken by the people. The third section, theme, after monotheism and covenant is history. It's a this world religion. Jews focus on how God, especially as we see the roots of Judaism, on how God is active in history. Now, this produces in the Shoah or the Holocaust of the 20th century, where Jews were systematically, genocidally murdered by the Nazis. This produces a terrific crisis of faith for Jews. But because fundamentally Judaism sees that God is active in history. It's this world. It's not Judaism, not so much concerned with what's to come or what's called eschatology, but what's happening here. And thus, there's a concern about liberation and justice. It's an ethical religion which cares for the poor, the outcast, the orphan, and the widow. There is interesting because we don't see this in other ancient Near Eastern religions, this sense of concern for the ethics of the poor. But that is what comes through, especially in the prophetic tradition. It resonates through Heschel, that I mentioned earlier, who marched with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. All right, let's look at the beginning of the Bible. In the beginning, this is the first chapters of Genesis, chapters 1 through 3. And maybe, I know some of you do know this, many do not. If I had been asked about Genesis, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I was a first-year college student, I might have thought of the band, and now I know I'm dating myself, but the English band, the British band, with Phil Collins as a drummer and singer, the band of Genesis, instead of the book of Genesis. But anyway, Genesis is the name that is given the book by the Latin, by the English translation of a Greek word which means to become or to be. And here is the way that the Jewish study Bible begins. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, a first day. So there are some themes that arise from this, and you see in the picture a depiction of God giving life to all the animals, and particularly then to Adam, the first man. Adam in the Hebrew means human being, and to Eve, the mother of the living, on the sixth day of the 7 days of creation. And the days can mean periods of time or 24-hour periods in Hebrew, so that creates, as it were, creates a conversation with modern science and the age of the earth. Which is important and which we'll get to at some point in the course, but I want to focus today on the themes, these 5 themes. There's a goodness to the material world. God, in all the days of creation, says, "It is good. It is good." Listen to what God says, again, using the translation of the Jewish Study Bible, which is a fabulous text if you want to understand contemporary Jewish scholarship. God, this is Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, or 26. And God said, "Let us make man, Adam, in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on the earth." And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, God created them. God blessed them. And God said, "Be fertile and increase." Also translated, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on the earth." So there's a goodness to the material world. There's a goodness to this creation of the human being. God's image, it says, is in us, in all human beings. There's a basis of the rise of humanism in the world that this has not been something that's been held by cultures over the centuries. The kings and the rulers were seen as better than the peasants, but according to the Hebrew Bible, all of us bear the image of God. And the image means that we then are to take what we learn about God and live it out in the world. The Jewish tradition has this great saying that I treasure, the tikkun olam, the healing of the world, the healing of the whole. That's what we are called to do, bearing the image of God. And there is in this then a unity of body and soul. So there's a psychosomatic unity, which is really important. And in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, it says that God breathed the nephesh, the spirit, into the human being. Verse 7, "The Lord formed Adam, or man, from the dust of the earth." The same dust we learn that is made from the stars. That stardust makes us, as we would learn from other sciences. So the sense that in the text we are part of the earth. God blew into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. A unity of body and soul. It's not like our souls are what's important to God in the Hebrew tradition, but both body and soul. And there's a goodness of nature. So that's the affirmation of science. The affirmation of science that we can study the natural world. It says in Genesis 2 that what we would call science, science wasn't called science in the specific way we understand it until the 19th century, 1800s, 1830s actually. It was called natural philosophy, the study, the physis, study of nature. That's the Greek word. And so there's an affirmation of studying nature. And it says that Adam was brought all the animals and told to name them. That's part of the scientific task of classification. And mastering or having dominion is a way of understanding the scientific task as well. It's different from the Tao. The Tao tells us in the Tao Te Ching in Taoism that we can never rule over creation. To master creation is something that is not recommended. But in dominion, we can change and rule over the creation that we are given. So this is a contrast with Eastern religions, and specifically Taoism. The goodness of the material world, the image of God in all creatures, the unity of the human being, and the goodness of nature and affirmation of science. So in this first 3 chapters, it's such a foundational set of chapters in the Bible. If you don't know them, I would recommend you look them up. They're very easy. The Bible chapters are very easy to find on the internet. As I said, the Jewish Study Bible is great. The translation that scholars use is the New Revised Standard Version, very widely available version. You can read about these. So God creates. Here we see, again from the Sistine Chapel, that God gives the human beings, Adam and Eve, all the fruit in the garden to eat except for the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. The knowledge of good and bad. And when Adam and Eve eat of that, because whatever you tell somebody not to do something, of course they do it, then there's a fall from grace, a separation. This does not in Judaism imply what many of us know as original sin. If we've grown up in the Christian tradition, it's a separation nonetheless, and you can see in the slide how the angel sits at the east of the gate of Eden, and man and woman are barred from coming in. This is multiplied then in the story of Noah, who is a descendant of Adam and Eve. Ultimately, I'm fast tracking just a little bit after Cain and Abel, skipping over them and the first murder that occurs, until you have this expanse of evil in the world. There's an expanse that goes beyond what was originally intended in these first chapters of Genesis 2. Evil being all over the earth, and God repents in the language of the King James and says, I screwed up. I made this creation, and that's one way of reading. One of the texts says that, and so I'm going to destroy and remake the world, as it were, and I'm going to save, a male and female of each animal, and one family, the family of Noah, and thus there's Noah's Ark. Many of you know that story. It's a favorite of children's books. If you download these slides, I would encourage you to watch the creation narrative in the movie Noah from 2014 with Russell Crowe narrating creation and the fall and what happened up to the time of who's playing Noah in this movie. It's really, really well done. Just the cinematography and so on is just amazing. And he ends by saying, we did this. We human beings created this separation and this evil. So then you get to the key moments of monotheism. This is a great place to understand a nexus point where God calls Abram. Abram becomes Abraham. This have also, which means the name Abraham means father of many. Father of many, and you'll see it's father of a great nation. Promising this patriarch to bless many. The Lord said to Abram, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and I will shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. And I'm going to read just a little bit from the Hebrew Study Bible, the Jewish Study Bible. The universalism that marked Genesis chapters 1 through 11 having now failed, the Lord God begins anew, singling out one Mesopotamian, in no way distinguished from his peers as yet, and promising to make him a great nation, not numbered in the 70 nations of the chapter 10 of Genesis. When the Lord promises Abram, his name is changed to Abram in chapter 17, land, numerous offspring, and blessing, it constitutes a large extent a reversal of some of the curses of Adam and Eve. Exile, pain in childbirth, and uncooperative soil. The twin themes of land and progeny inform the rest of Torah, the Torah. In Genesis 12, these extraordinary promises come like a bolt from the blue, an act of God's grace alone. No indication has been given as to why or even when Abram's merits them. So you see this incredible shift, and this story is retold in chapter 17. And Abraham, again, is called and given this kind of covenant that we see. And his name is changed, as we put out, the father of a multitude. You shall no longer be called Abram, this is chapter 17, verse 5, but your name shall be called Abraham, which means, as the footnote says in this, a father of a multitude. For I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. So here's a couple themes that happen. The theme of covenant or berit. God makes agreements or covenants with Israel. They're really like wedding vows. The two people come together. In chapter 17, Abraham walks through two smoking animals, two divided animals and a smoke pot, and it's as if to say, if you break this covenant, it will be like what has happened to these animals. And God promises three things: the promise of land, the promise of a child, Isaac, the promise of the promise of land, the promise of child, and the sign of this covenant, which is circumcision, the cutting of the male foreskin on the penis as a sign of what is the covenant that God is making. I want to get to Genesis 22 and the sacrifice of Isaac in the next lecture. Let me just say now, as we close, here are two images of the Hebrew Bible from another class. If you want to search the web and together or separately and find one or two of the images, if I were to do a class, you would search it together, but feel free to, but search it individually and find one or two images for 10 extra credit points and send them to me. You're going to see later Moses looking over his flock, as he is called in Exodus. And then in the first, you see this image of Jesus in the Garden of Eden with the animals and with Adam and Eve. So next, we'll be looking in the next lecture at the sacrifice, or the calling to sacrifice Isaac.